Thanks for tuning in. I'm Scott Walter.
And I'm Michael Watson.
In this episode, we discuss the way that labor unions and environmentalists drive up the price of your car. This is the InfluenceWatch podcast. Influencers in Washington sometimes appear remote from our daily lives, but every time you turn the key or push the button to start your car, influencers have shaped your daily drive. A number of influencers, environmentalists, labor unions, and other activists make driving more expensive. For instance, recently at the urging of car makers, the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, relaxed Obama administration regulations that would have mandated much higher fuel mileage standards for car manufacturers, and they did so over the objections of environmentalists and some car parts suppliers. The so-called CAFE standards lead buyers of pickup trucks and SUVs to subsidize the buyers of compact cars and hybrid electric vehicles. Car buyers, at least those buying from Detroit's Big Three, also have to deal with paying for lavish union wage and pension packages that were negotiated by the United Auto Workers Union. But less than a decade after making out like bandits at the expense of taxpayers in the Chrysler and GM government bailouts, the union is rocked by scandal as the feds pursue former UAW leaders and Chrysler executives for a corrupt kickback scheme. Mike, I believe you just bought one of those cars that those of us who have an SUV are subsidizing.
Yeah, I just bought a new Honda Fit. So I'd like to personally thank all the sport utility vehicle, pickup truck, and performance car drivers in the audience for somewhat subsidizing my purchase.
Now, we all got a choice to decide about subsidizing your car when exactly?
You didn't. That's how this all works.
Oh, yes, that's right. We're in Washington. This just sort of happens, yes.
In the 1970s, when I'm sure everyone watching was alive, I certainly wasn't, the Nixon administration, at the height of the oil crisis, decided that they would bring the car into the future by mandating these so-called corporate average fuel economy standards. And more or less, there are so many loopholes that it's hard for me to fully wrap my head around, much less to then explain. The EPA sets rules that let's use Honda as an example. When you look at the Fit, the Civic, the Accord, the performance models of the Civic, anything that doesn't technically qualify as a light truck, all has to average a certain gas mileage. And as a result, if you want to buy something at the heavy end of the spectrum, a big car or a big vehicle that doesn't qualify as a light truck, then the company has to sell more little cars. And the way that they sell more little cars is to have cross-subsidization between the big cars and little cars.
Because the point is it's the average mileage of all the cars sold.
Right. It's the average across the company. And then, some of these subsidies, these cross-subsidies get wild. I was reading, apparently, Fiat Chrysler, the Fiat 500e, which is their electric city runabout econobox thing, they sell at a $14,000 loss, or they were selling at a $14,000 loss at one point, just so that they could sell more Dodge Chargers and Dodge Hellcats and
because they have to
high performance and big sedans.
Yeah. They have to force on an unwilling public the little cars to improve, which have high mileage, to improve the company's overall mileage record. Now, the Obama administration regulations that are now being monkeyed with by the new administration were pretty darn extreme, weren't they? What was it supposed to top out at 2025?
Their number in 2025 was supposed to be 54.5 corporate average, with, again, modified by the loopholes. The car I just bought, which is a tiny econobox, gets 40.
Yeah, so in other words, your little tiny car, which my family of 6 would probably not fit in on for an extended vacation.
Not legally. No, it only seats 5.
In fact, we'd probably have to strap somebody to the... Forget strapping luggage to the roof, we'd have to strap the kid to the roof.
You'd have to hide somebody in the trunk, yeah.
So that thing of yours doesn't come close to the average to be required in 2025, and that's an average after taking into account the Honda Pilot full-sized SUV. That
Right.
if they're allowed to sell one of those.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, and for this reason, because American drivers who don't live in downtown Washington, D.C. and have to parallel park more than they actually drive, generally prefer larger, more substantive, more seats that you get in a sport utility vehicle, a minivan, a full-size sedan.
Yeah. And by the way, let's throw out there as well, of course, let's say that I'm a poor recent immigrant trying to get my lawn service company functioning. Gosh, am I going to be able to fit my lawnmowers? Am I going to be able to tow my lawnmowers behind your fit?
No. For that you need a pickup truck. And so for all these many good reasons, the car companies have found, and as thanks to the fracking revolution, the price of fuel has fallen from where it was back in 2008 to 10.
Yeah, have to say real quick. Amusingly, the frackers managed to hurt the oil companies' profits much more than by lowering the price of the commodity.
The Obama administration, the environmentalists, really wanted to get at big oil, and it ended up being a glutton oil supply that got at big oil.
Yes.
But so these rules were promulgated in, I believe it was sometime between 2009 and 2011 in the early Obama administration, and back then, gas was more expensive. People were buying more small cars. There was a thinking that small cars and car sharing was going to be the wave of the future, and then the price of oil came down, and then the economy recovered, and now people are buying. Why? They're buying sport utility vehicles, light trucks, minivans, all the big vehicles that Americans like with our large suburban home. Not our, because I live in downtown Washington D.C., but your large suburban homes.
Yep. Let's also add in there, too, of course, if you were a farmer, you, too, might not be able to get by with an econo box for your work.
You need a pickup truck.
Yes.
People who are hauling around, or building materials, farm equipment need towing capacity, need a bed to put 2x4s in. I don't.
Yep.
But other
now,
people
of course,
do.
I'm sure it's entirely coincidental that the Obama administration's vote totals in rural areas with lots of pickup trucks was somewhat low.
And again, in that sort of things you'll never hear about from the media. Shortly after Trump got elected, a gentleman on Twitter by the name of John Ekdahl proposed to the press corps, who mainly live in large metropolitan areas, and if they own cars like mine, how many people do you know with a pickup truck? And they just got so offended by it, which is interesting because I believe at the time, and I believe it is still the case, that the best-selling single-make model in the United States is a Ford F-150.
Yes. So, not that the media is out of touch at all, but now, so we have a classic case here of regulations, of course, tend to just ratchet, get more and more constricting on everyone until things become so painful that then the lies and dodges and complications that employ so many of our fine lobbyists here in D.C. start to take effect. So, as has happened, the car manufacturers and their lobbyists and their the trade group is
the Alliance of Automobile Manufacturers, I believe, is their current name.
Yeah, so that's
formerly the Auto Alliance.
There you go. Well, you got to change it every few years so people don't know what it is.
So it freshens up a bit. You get the lobbyists all get new suits. It's all
yes. So they now have the task of sort of pretending not really to be doing anything, but in fact making all kinds of horribly complicated tweaks to these ever-tightening regulations so that their business clients can squeak by. So what are a few of the dodges, lies, fakes, and the rest that we're dealing with on this?
Well, let's go back to 2016. So after the November election, Trump wins, surprising just about everyone in Washington. The Obama administration EPA, the way that these rules were written, there is a midterm review halfway through this, halfway through the big long cycle that ends in 2025. And the Obama administration EPA, realizing that the Trump administration EPA was probably going to be more inclined to take a deregulatory approach, more inclined to listen to the concerns of the automakers, rushed the midterm review in between the election and the inauguration in January of 2017. So now the Trump administration has initiated a rulemaking, which is a formal process that by which the government regulates or unregulates, in order to ease that 54.5 miles to the gallon target. Now, even amongst the auto manufacturers, there are some who want a more easy target, and others who want just a little bit easier target. I believe Honda's in the little bit easier category.
Because they're actually selling a fair number.
Because they're selling a fair number of small cars, whereas a Ford is selling a bunch of pickup trucks. So there's some conflict there. The manufacturers of engine control units and other technical car innovations that manage, the electronic part that in those V8s that turn off the 4 cylinders when you're sitting at the stoplight, they want to keep the
tough standards.
Keep the CAFE standards as high, even if they can't get them to be as high as the Obama administration wanted them. They want to keep them high so that there's still a demand for their engine management products.
Yep. And let me jump in there just to make the point. This is a very classic phenomenon in regulation, and that is the left loves to preen about we're opposed to those horrible big corporations, but nearly always in the end it comes down to actually there are corporations on both sides of an issue, and you folks are helping one side of corporations.
If you are a manufacturer who has an advantage when people like me come to the dealership to buy a really small car, you want to keep the CAFE standards high. Maybe not as high as the Obama administration had them, but you want it to be. I mean, in fact, the way that the Obama administration standards are written, there's a trading system. So if real world example, Fiat Chrysler, they were missing the targets, so they had to buy a bunch of these credits and
from companies that had more than
were meeting the target, like Honda. So you can see where, even if both Chrysler and Honda want it to be somewhat easier, Honda would like it to be stricter than Fiat Chrysler.
Yes. So please, our left-wing listeners, keep in mind you are helping one set of big corporations against another. That, by the way, explains why when you look at political donations by big corporations, they typically split around 60-40 between the parties, almost even, as opposed to...
Businesses are far more interested in backing winners and getting the ear of legislators than advancing an ideological program in a way that a trades union is, and the way that a single-issue group is.
Exactly. So if you look at single-issue groups, trade unions, and their hard political giving, the numbers tend to be not 60-40, but 97-3, 98-2, 99-1, or 100%. As we've discussed on previous shows that we've had. Well, so you talked about we talked a bit about how the regs are being twisted and contorted. There's also, I believe, even more complicated. You can get car manufacturer can get credit for little teeny tweaks to its cars. And that, too, counts, even if those tweaks don't really show up in the actual mileage.
Right. There's rules about the car's footprint, apparently, how much land it takes up when it's parked. It's all very complicated.
And wasn't there and then air conditioning? Something about the air conditioning? I think I remember reading certain types of air conditioning components will get you credits and all. So yes, and again. We want to remind people, if you think you like the sound of some of these regulations, let us remind you that these regulation regimes only get not only more and more tight, but they also get more and more complex so that no normal human being can ever make sense of them, which is ideal for the lobbyists whose entire lives revolve around tweaking the tiny little things that even the congressional staffers they're talking to don't understand.
And if you think that these, these very large multinational companies like the automakers aren't using those loopholes to advance their interests, no, they are.
Yes. Well, and that's another thing. When you have to employ lots of lobbyists who specialize in these things, and by the way, the lobbyists typically were previously Hill rats working for various members of Congress or themselves members of Congress. In addition to that, the only big companies can pay for all the accountants and lobbyists and the rest that are required to comply with the horrible regulatory regime,
right, so
which means that
if you were planning to resurrect the Packard brand,
yes,
you'd have to deal with all of this stuff that was written by GM.
Yeah. So again, for our friends on the left, all your regulatory regimes help to entrench the biggest car manufacturers and absolutely prevent little guys from ever being able to break into a market. Well, let's switch from the car manufacturing side of this to the car labor union side of this. As we mentioned at the beginning, there has been a big fat and continuing to develop scandal related to the main car workers union, which is the United Auto Workers. They and executives at Chrysler had some very interesting arrangements going on. Tell us a bit about that, Mike.
Sure. So the UAW represents the auto workers of what are traditionally called the Big Three, the Detroit Big Three: General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler, which was now after the auto bailout, which involved a massive payoff to the United Auto Workers by the Obama administration, Fiat Chrysler. They were bought by Italian Fiat. And in 2014-15, they were negotiating their new collective bargaining agreement to cover all the workers at the various Fiat Chrysler plants. And it was fairly controversial. The workers were rather disinclined to ratify it. They thought it was not favorable enough to them, and it was hard fought. The UAW had to hire the labor PR firm Berlin Rosen
which you can find a long write-up in InfluenceWatch.
Had to hire the PR firm Berlin Rosen, this big labor union PR firm that's worked for prominent Democratic politicians like New York State Attorney General Eric Schneiderman and New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio, to advocate that yes, you workers should ratify this contract. And
so just to reinforce that, the bosses hired a PR firm to get the workers.
No. The UAW, the union bosses hired the PR firm to convince the workers to vote for the contract the union bosses negotiated with Fiat.
Yes.
And as that was going on, lo and behold, we discover that the Fiat Chrysler chief negotiator, a gentleman by the name of Al Iacobelli, was paying kickbacks, money
to the union leaders who were in charge,
to union officials who were in charge of the negotiation and then in charge of advocating for it to be ratified.
Well, now kickbacks said maybe they were a little small, like maybe a couple of tickets to a ball game, or was it bigger than that?
We're talking in the millions of dollars, $1.5 million. Iacobelli pled guilty to arranging $1.5 million. It looks like it might have been even bigger.
I think I saw $4.5 million at one point.
The most recent number I have seen is that the feds are alleging $4.5 million, and they were paying it to the ringleader on the union side was a gentleman by the name of General Holyfield, who had the decency to pass away before all of this came out.
Although his widow is being pursued by the police.
His widow, I believe, pled guilty, but I am not certain of that. She either has been charged or has pled guilty, as have other and other union officials have been charged. For whatever it's worth, the international president of the United Auto Workers is absolutely certain that the kickback scheme did not affect the collective bargaining.
Yes, I'm sure $4.5 million it provided no lubrication whatsoever.
No lubrication whatsoever.
But even though, as you said a minute ago, somehow a lot of the workers didn't think it was a particularly good contract for some odd reason. But well, I want to follow up on the widow of General Holyfield there, one of the union guys involved in the scam. Not only did she benefit because her husband was getting all kinds of money and perks and goodies, but since we focus on the nonprofit world, I want to point out that prosecutors are alleging that Ms. Morgan's photo business once received $70,000 from a charity that was supposed to help children struggling with hardships. And the government says the charity was really a sham set up by General Holyfield and the Fiat, the lead briber in the Fiat side.
The Fiat Chrysler executive who apparently organized all this.
Yes, and one of them, as I recall, on the union side, even bragged that this is how we keep the union guys fat, dumb, and happy, is with all of the millions in lubrication. So, by the way, I think the last thing I saw was that we are now up to 6 people who have been charged.
Yeah,
in this scheme.
And there is some suspicion now that the feds are going to have to go reopen investigations into, because how the UAW bargains with the automakers. It's a common labor tactic. It's used if you're in California, it's used in grocery stores. It's called pattern bargaining. If I am the union, one union represents workers across multiple firms. So the UAW represents GM, Chrysler, and Ford. And the UAW knows that if the UAW had a really, really padded, fat contract with GM and a lean austerity contract with Chrysler, that would give Chrysler an advantage over GM, and that would risk the possibility of losing members from losing business at Ford. So what they do is they stagger the contracts so they all expire in order, and the union goes to whoever expires first and negotiates a contract that is going to serve as the model for all of them. And so, because there was this kickback arrangement, the question then becomes, if the UAW was engaged in pattern bargaining, was there also lubrication being engaged in by the other two? Nothing has been proven, but presumably it must be investigated.
No, certainly. And again, I think we should stress the millions upon millions of dollars that went into luxury vehicles, fabulous vacations, my personal favorite in the scandal, $35,000 Mont Blanc pens. That sounds like something you'd use to smuggle your money out of Switzerland.
Right. That sounds like the former governor of Virginia with a $75,000 Rolex, or the former Trump campaign chairman who had bought like several $1 million worth of rugs. It's had $35,000 pens.
Well, as I think about it, I'm 54 and I've never bought for myself or my family a $35,000 car. But anyway, the source of the millions upon millions of dollars involved in this lubrication scheme was a fund that was supposed to go to training workers and helping them be able to advance in their careers.
To advance in their career and compete with workers abroad and and to modernize the operations at the big 3 automakers.
Yes, and I would add, in the case of the charity from the wife of one of the union officials, that was a charity supposedly helping handicapped children. So this is unfortunately an ugly pattern in the sort of thing we talk about at InfluenceWatch.
I mean, I remember back when I first moved to Washington, one of the city councilors had a charity that was supposed to be for youth sports, and he was using it for embezzlement.
Yes. So we should always be wary about people preening on a public stage saying we are there to help the working families. We're there to help the worker and the rest. Well, not all of them are.
Intentions are not a substitute for aggressive oversight.
Yes. So not all of them are. And in fact, And the mainstream media, this is one of my complaints with the mainstream media, which somehow always manages to take the claims to purity and selflessness for granted, at least when they come from the left side of the spectrum.
Until the feds show up.
Yes. So, well, we talked about how the lavish contracts that unions are often able to have traditionally been able to win from the big three in Detroit. Well, of course, in my living memory, Detroit was one of the richest cities in the nation. That is not a sobriquet that has been given to it in recent years.
They're out of bankruptcy now.
Yes, barely. Although it took charity, partly because big charities,
partly because
foundations.
Was it the Ford Foundation that bailed them out?
One of the there were multiple, but yes, there were. So charities helped to bail the town out. But it's still not a very. Let's put it this way: you wouldn't want to be a realtor with the city of Detroit as your base.
You could certainly you would have to really. You'd have to be a really good
entrepreneurial.
You'd have to be a really entrepreneurial realtor to make a good living there.
So again in the same kind of pattern of claiming to help folks, but in fact ending up hurting them, the big three took great big hits, which is why there had to be that huge government bailout you've talked about from the taxpayers. And Detroit and Michigan as a whole are certainly not flourishing as a result of the monopoly bargaining power that the UAW had against those big three, so that the auto industry now is shifting to other states, mostly states that have right-to-work laws.
Although, partly because the economic depression brought on by the UAW, by both UAW labor practices and some mismanagement, drove so many people out of the state of Michigan. Michigan is now has been a right-to-work state since 2012. The core of union power sufficiently depleted because plants closed. People saw the high costs model was not working, and they were being outcompeted by, again, our ostensibly Japanese cars. Mine was manufactured in Mexico, but I'm pretty sure they make Accord somewhere in the southern United States. They make Nissans in Mississippi. They make Toyotas in Tennessee, I think.
And VWs. That was the big fight in Chattanooga.
Volkswagens in Tennessee, where the UAW got a toehold through a weird, basically, loophole in the labor law, despite the fact that when they tried to unionize the plant, they got voted down. And when the UAW last year went to Mississippi, despite bringing in, they brought in the cavalry. They brought in, was it Danny Glover?
Yep.
They brought in, they brought in like veteran. I think they brought in like veterans of the anti-apartheid campaigns in South Africa. They lost, I think, 2-1.
Yep, pretty badly. And meanwhile, some of our listeners are driving Fords that were not made in Detroit but Mexico. So even as I'm driving a Japanese car made in the Southeast America. Well, the larger theme of the show here is how all these influencers are making your and my cars, well, less yours than mine, cars more expensive. And I want to get one other quick thing in here before we go to some other stuff. We often discuss environmentalists, and there is a related thing that makes your daily commute more expensive, and that is, just as we have these unreasonable regulations for mileage in the cars that manufacturers sell, we also have unreasonable regulations for the ethanol in the gasoline that people have to buy. And our Vice President, Dr. Stephen Allen, testified last year at an EPA hearing because the EPA is also trying to look into this unreasonable, in fact, impossible to meet standards for the ever-rising addition of ethanol to gasoline. And I just want to quote his line here that these standards already, and certainly in the projected increase in ethanol requirements, they reduce the mileage of motor vehicles. They funnel money from consumers to well-connected crony capitalists. They raise the price of food, including food for the world's poor. They destroy rainforest and wetlands and expand the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. That's a pretty impressive accomplishment.
You have these. They were originally demanded by environmentalists, but in a classic case which you were describing earlier, where the supposedly fighting for the working man and fighting for the planet left aligns with corporate interests that then benefit from the regulations that are written. The farm state interests, the farm bureaus, the Corn Growers Association, seeing that they were going to be able to sell a lot more corn
At higher prices.
Aligned, and they were and are the ones who are really driving this, even more so now than the environmentalists.
Yes. But those wonderful, selfless, altruistic environmentalists helped them out. Well, speaking of our environmentalist friends, and switching back to the CAFE standards, the regulations that govern
we're all talking about fuel. Now we're talking about how efficient you have to be.
How efficient the fuel is burned in your car. The Sierra Club has been particularly active in fighting for the high mileage regulation, I believe.
Yeah, the Sierra Club, which is one of the bigger, they might be the biggest, but they're one of the couple biggest.
And should be looked up on InfluenceWatch.org to check.
Environmentalist groups in the country, they have pushed very heavily, and especially, again, taking that sort of left-wing tactic of picking a target and freezing it, they've gone specifically after Ford, and they've been doing this kind of on a myth, which they apparently invented 12 years ago. Supposedly, according to the Sierra Club, the Model T made in the 1910s was getting 25 miles to a gallon of gasoline. To the extent that anyone has attempted to confirm this, that is a myth. The Ford apparently says it was between 13 and 21. Motor Trend agrees with Ford. But the idea was by the Sierra Club was that we'll say, ha, you haven't improved gas mileage in 100 years, therefore you are in cahoots with big oil for some evil, dark conspiracy. There's a very good reason that the progress in fuel mileage has not been as high as groups like the Sierra Club might want, and that's that cars have gotten a lot heavier.
And let me guess, are there regulations pushed by other parts of the left, Ralph Nader, call your office, related to this?
Right. No, you have the so-called consumer advocacy groups. A lot of them, this is how Ralph Nader got his start, right? With the Pinto and the supposedly faulty fuel tank.
Well, and before that, the Chrysler Corvair, but that was long before you were born. Unsafe at Any Speed was, I think, his very first book, which referred to the Corvair.
Certainly one of the titles of his books.
Which I can add, one of my aunts had Corvairs, adored them, drove them until they weren't made anymore, and then drove her last one until it literally fell apart. That's how much she loved Mr. Nader's Boogeyman.
But so as a result of people like Mr. Nader, there's been increased safety features, and then because consumers want them, increased comfort features. And as a result, my little Honda Econobox is about 50% heavier than the Model T, which means that even though the engines have gotten a lot more efficient, they're pulling a lot more weight.
Yep. And our friends at the Wall Street Journal like to point out that that coffee will not kill you, but cafe standards may kill you. So that's another issue here, isn't it?
The drawback to my car is that if I get in a crash with a big car or a truck, there's a lot less to crumple and a lot less until it gets inside the safety cell, inside the cabin, and starts hurting you.
Yes.
The Insurance Institute for Highway Safety, who are generally recognized as the experts in automobile safety in the United States,
and they're just bean counters in this case.
They work for basically the car insurance companies, the people who have a vested financial interest in determining how much damage car crashes do.
Yeah, accurately.
Accurately.
Yes.
They on their list of recommended cars for teenage drivers, and you're worrying about, is my kid going to crash, and if he does crash, which he probably will he be safe? They recommend no. They assert fully bigger, heavier vehicles are safer, and on their recommended list they have no small or mini cars, because if you do crash, bigger tends to be better.
Sure. And now that was, amusingly, that was a business group's researchers being honest and accurate in what's going on. Some of the government bureaucracies that swirl around these regulations have been less honest, I believe, about this.
They may have been. I certainly wouldn't put it past the Obama administration, EPA, to nudge people down at the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration to assert that the econoboxes do just as fine when they get hit by a semi truck, as implausible as that is. And that's one of the things in the rulemaking that the Trump administration has brought forward. Again, the complexities of regulation. What would be the effects of setting the Obama administration standard on traffic safety?
Yep. No, that's true. Well, while we're discussing the environmentalist aspect of this, Sierra Club is certainly taking one of the top roles of leadership, but you also have groups like the National Resources Defense Council involved and the Union of Concerned Scientists. They both were big lobbyists for the Obama administration rules.
And both staunch advocates for very strict restrictions on automobiles. It's very interesting for the NRDC, given that one Leonardo DiCaprio is on their board, and I'm pretty sure he flies private.
The last news story I saw, thanks to his publicist, was I think he might even have gotten down to coach on a flight. But I'm sure they were probably paying for a lot of photographers to take his picture in
paying
coach.
for the photographers, and of course, I read somewhere once that if you fly internationally, you have emitted more carbon dioxide just from your round trip international flight. I suspect Mr. DiCaprio takes more than one per year, than the average person does just with their living their lives.
Yes, well, you need a little time in Fiji to relax from the roughness of cashing those paychecks for the movies you make. But before we close, is there anything else that we should say about the United Auto Workers, which has traditionally been one of the larger of the heavy industry unions in America? Now, those are declining in influence compared to the government worker unions, but still, the UAW is nothing to sneeze at.
The UAW still has a pretty high membership. They're also trying to expand outside of the auto industry. Casino workers in some states are now UAW represented. UAW has tried to organize graduate students, graduate teaching assistants at universities, and have had some success, although the changing in administrations and the changing at the National Labor Relations Board is going to affect whether or not that's going to be allowed, at least for the current administration.
Now, I have to jump in there and say that I strongly suspect that the average United Auto Worker at a car manufacturer maintains a much higher standard of producing what he's supposed to produce, much higher quality work product than the average graduate assistant in our nation's institutions of the higher learning. But
Fords are pretty good now.
Yeah.
But yeah, and they also are trying and have tried with only extremely limited success to organize the southern transplant plants like Honda, and Toyota, and Nissan. What's perhaps more interesting to kind of tie this all together, a lot of what we've been discussing are issues of consumer choice, of the buyer's wishes versus the wishes of the government, and the wishes of these left of center advocacy interest groups. So you have environmentalists who want everyone to drive small cars, to drive electric vehicles, to drive, ideally not to drive.
Yes, exactly.
And then you have the United Auto Workers, who are very adamant that you buy a union-made car. Famously, for a very long time, the UAW, at all UAW union halls, there was a rule that you couldn't park our foreign,
a quote-unquote foreign car.
a quote-unquote foreign car in the UAW lot. Right now, the administration is proposing a renegotiation of the North American Free Trade Agreement, which means that if I was buying my car next year, if it goes badly, I might have had to pay duty on it. And the UAW is very adamant that the labor standards in any renegotiation be union labor standards. It's a classic case. Again, it's a classic case of an interest group trying to protect itself, and in that way going right through consumers.
Yes. So neither the consumer nor, in many cases, the workers themselves, as we saw in the Fiat Chrysler scandal, can trust their supposed saviors and benefactors. Well, that is our show for this week. If you're listening to this on iTunes or Stitcher, know that we broadcast a live video version of this podcast on Thursdays at 10 a.m. on Facebook Live and YouTube. You can find our pages by searching Capital Research Center. And if you're watching the video version, we encourage you to subscribe to the audio on your preferred podcast platform. We'll see you next week.